This is Buddhism in a nutshell, and this is our second class of Buddhism in a nutshell. And like all our classes, these are recorded, so if you miss any, you can always go back and catch it on the TNL YouTube site. And or if I spoke too fast and you didn't understand, you can also go back to the YouTube and repeat things over and over again as many times as you want until you get it. So it's always good to know about that. So anyway, in our, so this is our second class. In our first class, we gave a very broad general introduction to Buddhism. Perhaps so broad that maybe it was a little vague even. But that's okay. I mean, I think it's always good to begin broad and vague and then to get more specific and detailed as we go along. And that will be my goal. Of course, we're covering all of Buddhism in 4 hour-and-a-half sessions. So we're covering a huge amount of ground very quickly. So there's limits to how detailed we can get. But that's okay, because the purpose of this course is to give you the background so that you can then take other courses that are more specific on specific topics and dig deeper into the details. But nonetheless, I will try to give as much detail as I can, because I want you to have a real sense of what the teachings really mean and enough examples so that you can really get a good feeling for what we're talking about. So in the first course, we did also the life of Buddha. We talked about that. And we also talked about how Buddhism spread all around the world and all the different forms that Buddhism takes. And as I said before in that class, because Buddha, when he died, refused to appoint what I call the Pope of Buddhism, in other words, a leader, someone who would be the head guy, to lead the Sangha or the Buddhist monks and the laity. Because he refused to do that and instead said, the Dharma, meaning the Buddhist teachings that I have taught, let that be your guide. Let that guide you in your spiritual path. That's all you really need. For that reason, actually, Buddhism has developed a lot of diversity as it's spread around the world. And a lot of times it takes on even what I might call national or cultural characteristics. So each country has its own unique culture. And when Buddhism arrives in that country, they naturally try to develop Buddhism in a way that's sort of consistent with their culture, or that makes sense or feels comfortable to them. And so for that reason, that's actually a huge part of the different varieties of Buddhism. Another reason for the huge variety of Buddhist teachings is because a lot of times as Buddhism developed, it developed in terms of powerful spiritual leaders who were extremely deep spiritual leaders. And so when they taught, they would attract a lot of followers, and they would develop a little sect of Buddhism. And they would teach to their followers Buddhism the way it seemed natural to them, what they found helpful in developing their spiritual path. And for that reason, you got various colorings and shadings of Buddhism as it spread around the world. And even within a given country, there were often many different types of Buddhism. China is a perfect example. China had, I don't know, maybe 10, 20 different types of Buddhist sects. And even within something that in the West we would recognize, like Zen Buddhism itself in Japan has at least 3 major different types of Zen Buddhism. And there may be even more minor types of Zen Buddhism, I don't know. And of course, in China, there were many different types of Zen Buddhism, but also even other types of Buddhism. And even in Tibet, which is, I mean, our lineage from this center, from which I'm coming from, is from a Tibetan tradition. And in that Tibetan tradition, there are actually 4 major, you might call them lineages of Tibetan Buddhism. And each of those, there's a unity in all of Tibetan Buddhism, but there's also sort of unique characteristics associated with each of these four different lineages. And each of these four different lineages has its own administration, if you like. They have its own head guy, they have their own monks, their own monasteries, and so forth. So anyway, it's natural that Buddhism seems, at first glance, to a new Westerner who's first experiencing it, sometimes it can feel just a little bit strange, like there's like 50 different types of Buddhism. However, what I'm going to talk about today is really there's only one Buddhism. So there's one Buddhism, but centered around that Buddhism, I would say, are different practices, different ways that people have found helpful for following the spiritual path. And this was actually, in a way, encouraged by Buddha himself when he was alive. Buddha himself, when he was alive, made a big point of saying that people come in all shapes and forms. They have different backgrounds. They have different levels of spirituality. And he made a big point of the fact that whenever he gave a Dharma talk to a community, whether composed of monks or lay people or whoever, he would always adjust his teachings so that it would work with the people there, that they would hear things that were helpful to them. And that principle has always been carried on in all Buddhism. It's always been considered important to try to adjust your teachings to the people that you're talking to. And in fact, that also corresponds to language. When Buddha taught in the local dialect of where he was living in northern India. He did not teach in the intellectual language of India, which is the ancient Sanskrit, although I'm sure he was educated as a prince, so he had a princely education. So he had as we would say, the best education that money can buy. So I'm sure he knew Sanskrit backwards and forwards. But nonetheless, he deliberately chose not to speak in Sanskrit, but to speak in the local dialects. And in fact, he encouraged his followers that when they moved to different areas, that they would again continue to speak in the local dialects. So the local dialect he spoke in is actually a variant of Sanskrit. And people who know Sanskrit would probably be able to follow what he was saying. It's sort of like the dialects are sort of like simplified Sanskrits, simplified in certain ways. And there were probably dialectical variations. He moved around in different areas in northern India, and probably each of the areas he moved to had slightly different dialectical variants. We don't precisely know what specific dialect he spoke, but they were probably all pretty similar. Okay, so the other thing that unifies all of Buddhism is Buddha, as I mentioned last week, has one unifying doctrine, if you like, or teaching, which are called the Four Noble Truths. And what Buddha said is he said that these Four Noble Truths aren't just something that he made up, but these are actually the way reality really is. This is the way the world really works. And moreover, he said that, once these truths are explained to somebody, that you can directly see the truth of them for yourselves. And in fact, that's important because the way that we achieve what obstructs our spiritual journey is the defects or negativities in our own mind. And essentially, enlightenment, if you like, the main goal of Buddhism, is essentially removing all of these negativities or impurities of our mind. And once you achieve that, then you achieve a state known as nirvana, which we will explain more as we go along. But particularly in meditation, which is the most useful tool, because meditation is a way that you can directly probe your own mind, that you can actually see your own mind, how it's working if you meditate correctly. That meditation correctly in many ways means, to simplify it, it means not just cycling over things in your mind over and over again, the way we do when we're falling asleep, or we can't let go of things. We just keep thinking this, we get these cyclic patterns where we keep thinking the same thing over and over again. That's not the right way to meditate. That way of meditation involves the ego, and it's distorted. When we meditate in that way, we don't see the world as it really is, because it's distorted by what appears good to our ego or what appears bad to our ego, and that causes us to distort how we see the world. Whereas the correct way of meditation is in what's known as mindfulness meditation, is basically sort of seeing things objectively. So it's sort of like when you meditate, you are just aware of things that come up in your mind, feelings, emotions, thoughts, but you treat it almost like you're a third person watching it, like you're an alien who can peer into your mind. So instead of saying, oh, I hated it when that person did this thing today, the way you meditate on it is more like, oh, hatred arose in my mind when I experienced this person doing this. So it's more like, this it's almost like just noting this emotion occurred, this thought occurred. And then usually in traditional meditation, you focus on one thing like your breath and continue on. So anyway, I don't have time to explain meditation, but one should just be aware of the fact that it's important to know how to meditate and how to meditate correctly, and how to do this sort of mindfulness meditation where you don't get involved with your ego. You don't think, I did this, I felt this. It's more like you're just aware of the thoughts and feelings as they arise. Okay, so now we're going to plunge really deep into Buddhism. And in a way, these Four Noble Truths encompass all of Buddhism. But in terms of our path through this series of Buddhism in a nutshell, what we're going to do, it's useful to be aware of, even though I said that all Buddhism is the same, it is useful to be aware that there was a change in Buddhism roughly chronologically about the same time as the birth of Christ, maybe the 1st century BC or 1st century AD. There started to be this new movement called Mahayana Buddhism. And this Mahayana Buddhism, as I see it, is sort of like an extension. It's not really even so much an extension of Buddhism as it's a particularly emphasizing certain aspects of Buddhism and bringing them out very strongly. And however, it adds a big change in a lot of Buddhist practice. And so that's the part we're going to tackle next week. And in particular, the thing that's really important in Mahayana Buddhism is a concept that's known as bodhicitta. And so I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about what bodhicitta is, how you develop bodhicitta, why it's important, and so forth. And this is important because, as I said, there's millions of different sects of Buddhism all over the world. However, the vast majority of them are Mahayana types of Buddhism. And so the Mahayana is really important to understand. And that's what Tibetan Buddhism is Mahayana, Zen Buddhism is Mahayana, most of the things that you will encounter in the West. There is something that's closer to the original Buddhism that Buddha taught, and that was a form of Buddhism that spread to Sri Lanka, which in the ancient days was called Ceylon, and today that's called Theravadan Buddhism. In the West, it's often called Vipassana Buddhism. And then there's a large number of centers in America that practice Vipassana Buddhism. But that is not Mahayana. That's different. The Mahayanas used to call that Hinayana, which is sort of like an insult because Maha means great and Hina means lesser. So the greater vehicle and the lesser vehicle are the more precise translations. And so, but the Theravadins, it's more like calling themselves the elders, is a closer translation of how they refer to themselves. And what the Dalai Lama refers to them nowadays as foundational Buddhism, because actually Mahayana Buddhism is built right on top of Hinayana Buddhism. And you have to practice all of the aspects of Hinayana Buddhism to actually correctly practice Mahayana Buddhism. So it's more, so you should look at it more like they're not two separate things. It's more like Mahayana builds on top of the Hinayana and adds sort of new wrinkles that sort of, in a way, almost extend it, but as I say, are really consonant even with the original Buddhism. But at any rate, so the next time I will talk about bodhicitta and what this Mahayana Buddhism means. And then the fourth and final class, I will talk about some deeper things. I will talk particularly about the notion of emptiness, and I will talk about that more from a Mahayana perspective, because that is what's considered the most important aspect from a Mahayana point of view to achieving full enlightenment. It's actually considered the most important sort of thing in the Hinayana or Theravadan path, but they use a slightly different language, even though Buddha himself did refer to some of his teachings in his lifetime as emptiness. But anyway, I will discuss. So in the fourth one, I will talk more about emptiness. And I will also talk a little bit about Tantric Buddhism, which interests a lot of people. And I will give a very simple introduction, try to give you just a feeling for what that's all about. And I think in a nutshell, since we're Buddhism in a nutshell, so we should talk about nutshells. In a nutshell, I think the correct way of viewing Tantric Buddhism is that it's a very set of powerful techniques that are used to accelerate your spiritual path. And so if you like, it's sort of, it's mainly a part of, it has to be a part of Mahayana Buddhism, because Tantric Buddhism only works if you operate within a bodhicitta motivation. So Tantric is squarely within the realm of Mahayana Buddhism. But anyway, it's quite interesting. It's considered, the thing they always say about it is that it's the quick path to enlightenment, how you can achieve enlightenment in a single lifetime. And I will also add some other aspects of the Mahayana path, some other, Mahayana has some actually wonderful teachings on what they call mind training and things like that. So I will mix a little bit of that in the fourth lecture or teaching, because a lot of those techniques are extremely helpful. And I myself have used them in times of stress or difficulty. Okay, so that's sort of the big picture. So let's return now to the Four Noble Truths. So what are they? So I mentioned them in the first class. So very quickly, they're true suffering, true cause, true cessation, and true path. And so I'm going to go carefully through each of these and explain them. And they all fit together as a neat little package. They're all highly interrelated and don't make sense unless you talk about them together. So again, to start off slowly and then add more details, true suffering is what Buddha's main mission, as he saw it, as he talked about his own bio during his lifetime. Whenever he mentioned his earlier life, he would often talk about what he saw as his mission. And his mission was to get rid of the suffering that we humans experience. He said, it's just unacceptable to have suffering, and there has to be a way of getting rid of it. And that was his goal. And so that's the first noble truth. And so we're going to explore what he means by suffering, because it's a little bit subtle. And I'm also, and it really, the more you understand what he means, the more interesting it gets, actually. So it goes beyond even just simple pain. So, but I think all of us would acknowledge that there is, even at the level of pain, there's horrible amounts of suffering, disease, hunger, famine, people torturing other people, just all sorts of horrible things that go on. And just getting rid of that, even without the more general or subtle distinctions, I think most of us would love. I think in our lives, there's nothing more that we care about than not suffering. We would all like to be extremely happy and blissful, and that's actually the real goal of Buddhism. Suffering is, if you like, the obstacle to being completely blissful and happiness. But it's actually useful to talk about the suffering first, because that actually bothers us more. That's something that really, really scares people, is suffering. Okay, so that's the beginning part, is that they're suffering. And so Buddha said, I found the solution. And that's when he was under the Bodhi tree, sitting under the Bodhi tree, and achieved complete enlightenment. At that moment, he had the answer. And so what Buddha said is so that brings us to the, actually, let me go in order. So the second, one can organize these noble truths in different ways, but as it's usually given, the second noble truth is the reason why Buddha said that he was able to find the solution to suffering, is he said, the reason why there's a solution to suffering is because there's actually a cause of suffering. There's a reason why suffering occurs. And so that's the second noble truth, the true cause of suffering. And we will explain what that cause of suffering is when we drill down into more detail. So Buddha said, okay, there's a reason why we suffer. However, the fact that there is a cause of suffering, the fact that suffering is not just totally random or crazy, that means that that gives you the idea, well, if there's a cause, then what we really need to do, if we can eliminate that cause, then we will eliminate suffering. And that's the third noble truth, true cessation. Buddha said, I know the cause, and there's actually a way to remove that cause. And so once you remove that cause, you have a total and final cessation of suffering, which is called nirvana. And we move from our ordinary life, which is called samsara. Again, I'm going to spend a lot of time discussing what that means, into the state of nirvana. And then the fourth final truth, I think, is basically the one that really matters, is it's great that, that there can be a cessation of suffering, but our real problem individually is that, how do we do it? How do we stop our suffering? And that's what the fourth noble truth is, true path. That's the truth path of saying that there is actually a procedure, a methodology, a spiritual path, where if you follow that path, that will lead you to be able to remove the cause of your suffering and achieve nirvana. And in fact, that's what Buddha said is actually his whole purpose of being here on earth, is actually to point out that path. And since that path, as I said before, involves changing our own mind, the Buddha himself can't give you some special blessing and, and then boom, poof, you're all enlightened. But we each have to individually take responsibility for achieving our own nirvana. But the Buddha said, I've done it. All you have to do is the same things I do, and you will achieve it also. And in fact, this notion of cause and effect permeates all of Buddhism as Buddha taught it. Buddha said there are causes and conditions for everything that happens. That is the nature of our world. The nature of our world is change, and what causes change are the different causes and conditions as they affect the world. And if you have different causes and conditions, the state of the world will become different. But the world is always changing moment by moment. It never stays the same. There's nothing permanent at all about anything in our world, again, that we call samsara. And so what Buddha said is basically, if you create the causes to remove your suffering, to achieve nirvana, you absolutely have to achieve nirvana. There's no doubt. There's no concern, whatever. If you create the correct causes, the results have to follow the cause. So, and Buddha said this is possible. I've done it. And in fact, during Buddha's lifetime, hundreds, maybe thousands of different monks achieved nirvana. I'm also going to talk a little bit about enlightenment or nirvana, and also another notion called liberation, because from the Mahayana school, there's some little wrinkles. So what a Mahayana Buddhist means by enlightenment is slightly different than the way that Buddha talked about it in his lifetime. But anyway, I will come to that and explain it more as we go along. It's all sort of roughly the same, but it's just useful to know that there are these little wrinkles. Okay, so that's, again, the big picture. So now we're going to drill down. Oh, and before we leave the big picture, it's also useful to talk about the medical analogy, because that's been found to be helpful to some people. And in fact, when Buddha was alive, he spent a lot of time using similes, analogies, little stories to explain the teachings, because basically people find it very easier to understand things when you have little stories and similes and examples. And so the example in the Four Noble Truths, which is sort of traditional and standard, is they talk about a medical analogy where suffering you can consider like a sickness. So it's like, I don't know, if you have, I don't know, some kind of sickness, and Buddha is considered to be the doctor, and all of his followers are sort of like the nurses or helpers, what we call the Sangha. The Sangha are the Buddhist community. And so he says they're suffering. So the doctor comes along and he says, oh, well, you know, you have this disease, and there's a reason why you have this disease. You know, you have this bug, or this part of your body isn't working right, or whatever. So this is the cause of why you have this problem. And so that's the second noble truth, the cause. And in this case, the third noble truth, the Buddha says, well, there's good news. For this particular disease that you have, there actually is a cure. And I even know the cure. And so that's the third noble truth, the cessation of suffering. And then the final deal is the Buddha says, you know, so if I'm going to cure you, you just have to follow these medical procedures, you know, take these drugs, or maybe I have to do this operation, or whatever it is. And so that's the fourth noble truth, the truth of the true path, the way, the method that you use to solve your disease, which our disease is suffering. So anyway, hopefully that's helpful to you. And like I say, if any of this seems very obscure, feel free to unmute yourself and just speak out. Feel free to interrupt me. I have no problem handling interruptions. Okay, so let's go back to suffering. So since everything is built on suffering, this is actually a big deal to understand what we mean by suffering. And in fact, as we're going to see, Buddha is going to tell us that suffering is really completely built into our whole life, everything we experience. And so I think for a lot of people, you know, when they hear this, they say, this is completely crazy. You know, people say, you know, I'm not suffering all the time. You know, I have these wonderful times in my life, you know, times of intense pleasure, wonderful things that happen to me where I'm absolutely thrilled and happy. You know, what's all this talk about suffering? You know, what's going on with this? And so I think that's, that's this point where I say that we have to be a little bit more discriminating, and we have to, and actually it's helpful to ask this question, what about pleasure? What about joyful moments? What about happy moments? Isn't that what we're all trying to be, is happy? And you're saying that all we do is suffering. Why would I want to join your following and deal with suffering? And the point of it is that actually we actually are suffering in many ways, but we don't pay attention to it. We don't pick up on it. And actually the whole point of the spiritual path is, following the spiritual path, we actually do achieve genuine bliss, extraordinary bliss and happiness that goes well beyond anything that any of us experience in our ordinary life. One of the founders of our group of centers used to talk about that. He would say, if people knew about these great spiritual pleasures, they would forget about sex, food, money, anything that you can think about. They would, it's like nothing compared to the joys that you can achieve, especially at very high levels of meditation, are just amazing. But anyway, but these are things that you have to be able to understand and experience for yourself. So if I just tell you these things, okay, you have a question. Yeah, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, thank you. So, Venerable Dandra led a meditation this morning that was very helpful to me. All of the aspects of Buddhism that I like, I think just training my mind has been the most beneficial. And his meditation this morning was basically on retracing the step that your mind has taken, basically. And I had a realization that I'm a musician. I've enjoyed music my entire life. And as much as I still absolutely love my punk rock and heavy metal, I could see that path in my mind of all of my singing. And as much as I love singing, those patterns forming this negative train through my past.
Mm-hmm.
And that realization has really helped me to want to change that, and not, there's that whole attachment thing too. You get attached to these and you have to kind of cleave yourself away. But there's this space in between the realization and the application that feels like you're slipping, like you don't have anything to hold on. You kind of flailing around trying to get to where you need to be in order to put the actualization into place so you can achieve that next level. And that's where I'm at right now. I'm just kind of slipping around, trying to grasp onto the next, I don't know, it's a realization, but I'm trying to get to where I can actualize, and I don't really have the footing to be able to actualize without, kind of losing it a little bit. So if you can elucidate, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think that's that's a very important question, because I think, especially in our meditations, it's very easy to sort of feel lost, to feel like, that we sort of lost our footing. We don't know where we are. It can be very confusing. My own experience with respect to these realizations is that all of us have, like, this is like a mini realization that you're talking about, a small step along the path. And these are absolutely probably the most important types of little realizations, because these build up slowly into a bigger spiritual path. But what I have found in my own practice, and I try to meditate for roughly about an hour every day, half hour in the morning, half hour in the evening. What I find is that over time, if you can just hang in there. So, I'm not sure, you can do different types of meditation. The two main types of meditation are single-pointed meditation and mindfulness meditation. And they actually work together, and you actually need both. You usually develop the single-pointed meditation where you hold a single object in your mind as a way of developing the power of your meditation, the ability of your meditation to be more stable and to penetrate more deeply. And the mindfulness meditation is a meditation where you get the insight, sort of these little realizations that you talk about. Although you can also get these realizations with the single-pointed meditation.
Okay.
So,
but the Vajras, excuse me, Vajrasattva meditation, would that be considered single pointed, or is that a different category?
yeah, Vajrasattva would probably be, probably that would be a single-pointed, because you're probably focusing on one aspect and then trying to hold that in your mind. Really trying to penetrate. Vajrasattva has to do with purification. So presumably you're holding one aspect of purification in your mind while you're meditating. Again, I don't know quite how you're doing Vajrasattva. Different
I
people.
follow the Venerable Katie's meditation every weeknight. So.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know quite what she does, but at any rate, it almost doesn't matter, because whether you're trying to single-pointedly hold something, or maybe just vaguely hold the whole general area in your mind and just sort of trying to understand it better by holding it in your mind, or mindfulness might be, you might be also doing some kind of thinking about it, thinking about the process of purification or what you need to purify. You can do it different ways. But what I always find is that what you most need is patience. That if you had, what you need to do is just keep doing it. And as you keep doing it, what will eventually happen is, at some point, at least this is what happens to me, is like I'm confused, I don't know what I do, but I just keep holding that in my mind. And then at some point, just like out of the blue, an idea occurs to me, and suddenly it makes sense. Suddenly I understand it. So suddenly I feel like I've moved forward. And so for you, I'm not sure what the confusion is about, whether it's about how you purify or the procedure or how it works, or it's like there could be potentially different things in your mind. But whatever it is just keep holding that in your mind and just keep your focus on that. I mean, we always have distractions that carry us away, and in all meditation, we keep bringing our mind back to the same place over and over again. But if you keep doing that, I think you will eventually find clarity, but you just have to be patient with it. Okay. And I've often been amazed, because I've often felt like there's some part of my spiritual life that's completely confusing. But I've always found that if I just hang in there and stay with the meditation, keep my mental focus, that eventually clarity, at least for me, has always eventually come. So I don't know if that's helpful.
Yes, it actually is. I think going back to that aspect of that single point in that mental, following that mental train of thought that brings you to the realization, is a good way to kind of get footing instead of feeling like I'm flailing. So that is helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, and the other thing too is, the key in all of the meditation is to get rid of your ego. Because I think the thing that distracts us is you feel like, oh, I'm flailing around. We attach ourselves to the meditation. Mm-hmm. And that acts like an obstacle. And so if you can think about it not as I'm flailing around, but more like, oh, confusion is in my mind right now.
Okay.
Confusion is arising. There's confusion. Yeah. And don't attach yourself so personally to the success of the meditation or the feeling of where you are along the path. But it's more this sort of notion of being like a third person, where you're just like an observer. It's like it's like there is this thing in my mind, this emotion, this feeling, this thought, whatever it is, but there's this, but don't try to attach yourself so closely to it. And I
Yes.
think that if you can achieve this sort of more objective way of meditation, at least for me, I found that that's very helpful.
Yes, it is. When you mentioned ego initially and that aspect of it, when it pertains to music, there is so much ego in music. I'm wondering, especially
Yeah.
now having been a musician and how many ego clashes there are in bands. It's just, and that
Oh,
that
yeah.
leads me to where I can see
Well,
how that's where I was tripping up.
exactly. And it's sort of like stage fright,
Oh,
especially
yeah.
young beginning musicians, they get a lot of stage fright. And the reason they get stage fright is because their ego's involved. Oh, how am I doing? How are the people, do they like how I'm playing and so forth? And so you can freeze yourself completely if you develop this sort of ego attachment to what you're doing. And
Yes, and
so,
a lot of ego is involved in self-preservation. I mean, when you have a lot of eyes on you and somebody might throw a bottle if you suck, it kind of gets to where I think that may have been the formation of ego is either trying to prove your importance so you don't get hurt, or just, trying to squeeze by unnoticed so you don't get hurt kind of thing. It's still an attempt to avoid suffering, as it were.
yes. And in fact, I mean, as we're going to talk about shortly, it's that ego attachment, which is the suffering.
Yes.
That's, and you see it when you have stage fright. You
Hmm.
feel that suffering
Oh, yeah.
directly. Okay. So we will get more into that. But anyway, yeah, but those are good questions. It is, the spiritual path is tricky. And that's why it is helpful to have people that you can talk to about it to get explanations, because it helps to have people who have gone through it before and who can share their experiences.
Yes, I'm very grateful for all you. Thank you.
Okay, so let's go on. So let's go a little deeper into the suffering. So in Buddhism, the actual Sanskrit word, which is the same as Pali, it's probably the same as the local dialect that Buddha used, is the word dukkha, which you often hear. So, and this dukkha, this D-U-K-H-A, this dukkha really means, it can mean actual physical pain and suffering, like somebody cuts into you and you feel the suffering of that cut. But more generally, what it means is it means dissatisfaction. It means that something's not quite right, that it's not, there's something wrong what's going on. So dissatisfaction is actually sort of a better translation of dukkha. And in fact, people often say there are three different types of suffering. So once we generalize this notion to dukkha, as opposed to just simple suffering, there's always this problem we have whenever we translate into English. There's the original word in Sanskrit, or one of the Indian dialects. And of course, then there's our translation. And in the original Indian version of it, it has its own sort of connotations and so forth. And of course, when we talk about suffering, then that has sort of English connotations, and they aren't always exactly the same. But we have no choice. We have to translate. So they talk about three different types of suffering. The first suffering that they talk about is what they call manifest suffering, or the suffering of suffering. This manifest suffering, or the suffering of suffering, is what we mean by physical pain. So if you've got a pain in your stomach and you go see the doctor, or somebody hits you, or you have a wound, or you have some disease, that's sort of what ordinary suffering. So that's what I think in English we usually mean by suffering, although there can also be mental suffering also. And that is also, that mental suffering can also be manifest suffering, anxiety, worry, all of these sorts of things. People, in fact, usually mental suffering is far worse than physical suffering. As we'll talk about, actually, a lot of our physical suffering when you look deeper at it, is actually mental suffering. The mental suffering component is actually more important than the physical suffering component. But anyway, so that's the first type. Now, the second type is the suffering of change. And I think that this, when we start talking about the suffering of change, we start getting closer to what Buddha was really talking about when he's saying our whole world is filled with suffering. And so the suffering of change is the fact, results from the fact that, as I said before, everything that we experience in our world constantly changes. There is nothing permanent in our world whatsoever. You cannot point to any single thing that does not change. Everything in our world constantly changes. And for that reason, even pleasures become painful. And so how does this work? So it's easy to see how suffering is painful, but the way that pleasurable things can become suffering is exactly precisely because change happens. Because once you have something pleasurable, we almost always develop an attachment to it. So if we have something that's wonderful, we want to hang on to it. So we want it to continue. We want, if we're eating something fantastic, we want to keep eating it forever, you know. And the other problem too that we have is that in our samsaric world, in our ordinary world, actually, if you look more closely, none of the pleasures we experience are satisfactory. You know, and what I mean by that is, if you go to the best restaurant in the world, you take their best food, you take one bite, you can't just take that one bite and say, that was fantastic. Now I'm done. I don't have to do anything more. I'm satisfied. I can leave and go home. No, what happens is that we want to take the next bite, and the next bite, and the next bite. And in fact, we're almost always insatiable. You know, we want it to never end. But the problem with change is it always will end. There's nothing that can continue forever. So no matter what pleasure we have, it will shortly disappear. In fact, what usually happens to us is that we get used to whatever it is. So even if something is really, especially spectacularly tasteful, you know, the second moment, it's sort of tastes the same. And maybe by the 10th or 100, we maybe even start to get a little bored with it. So this is the problem of suffering of change, is we can't hang on to things. And because we can't hang on to things, it is unsatisfactory. You know, it's sort of like the kid at Christmas, where Santa Claus comes, he gets he's been waiting for months and months to get some special brand new spectacular toy or whatever. They pick it up, they play with it for a few minutes, and then if you watch young kids, a few minutes later, they'll just toss it aside and move on to the next thing. But it's like that. It's like having a new car. You know, there are people, when they get a new car, they will park 3 miles away from the store so nobody opens their car door and scratches their precious new car. But, you know, after a couple of years, they just don't care. They get scratched or whatever. So you can't hang on to any pleasure. And it's always painful when we give up those pleasures. So it's painful to have something wonderful and lose it. I mean, let's say you suddenly inherited $1 billion, you know, and you're so thrilled and you're so excited. And then the government comes by and says, oh, I'm sorry, this was stolen. You can't have it anymore. You know, we would be so disappointed. In fact, it's more painful to lose something precious than it is to never have had it in the first place at all. So this is the problem of the suffering of change. And I think it's, you know, it's one of these things that you have to play with yourself, you know, and this is actually useful in meditation, you know, paying attention to noticing when you feel pleasure and noticing your disappointment when that pleasure goes away. There's another way of saying this, is that the Buddha included in his sufferings the suffering of not getting what we want and having to encounter what we don't want. Because the negative side, the pushing away, having to experience things that we really dislike, that are hateful to us, that are disturbing, that is also part of suffering. So it's useful for each. Oh yeah, okay. You raised your hand again. Go ahead, Lorraine.
Yes, thank you. So I had it in my head a minute ago how I was going to phrase this, but so when it comes to what you want and getting the desires that you have in your mind and getting them and then finding how dissatisfactory they really are, there's a cultural aspect of we live in a very materialistic culture where it's encouraged. Greed is encouraged, and seen as some kind of cultural, like this is what you want to be, and it kind of feeds into that attachment. So I was just wondering if is there, I don't know, there's got to be a way to put some space between the cultural expectations and what their desires are for you and what your own desires are. There's got to be some space between there, because we're trying so hard to identify and be part of the culture because everybody's afraid of isolation, that you end up, basically spending yourself into oblivion trying to match up with cultural norms.
Yes.
But
No,
no,
that's true. There is a lot of pressure to conform, and our culture is filled with greed. I mean, that's why Buddhism is so revolutionary in our culture, is because it's the direct opposite of that. And so I would say, and in fact, speaking more directly to that point, one of the things that Buddha said, which is quite interesting, is he would always stress the importance of having good friends. There were times when he would say even that having good friends is the whole spiritual life. He thought it was so important. And I think that speaks to these sort of cultural expectations. So it's he would be saying, that these cultural expectations are like having bad friends who are encouraging bad behavior, bad things, but we go along with it because we're social people, and there's so much social pressure to conform. So Buddha would say, oh, what you need are some good spiritual friends to counteract that. So that is one way of counteracting it. And that's why we have Buddhist communities, for example, and why we go to Buddhist teachings, because that's one way of sort of counteracting that more general pressure. Although it's hard because, in society, the pressure is so pervasive. But ultimately, the deeper problem is with ourselves, though, is with our own desire for sensual pleasure. And Buddha said, basically, and again, this is revolutionary. I'm almost afraid to say it, but Buddha said, you have to give up sensual pleasure. And then we say, oh my God, no, I really don't want that. I don't want to give up my sensual pleasure. That's the best thing in life. If I give that up, my life is all over. It'll be painful, blurry, it'll be terrible. But actually, it won't be. And again, that's where one goes into these deeper understandings. And that's why, meditation is really, really helpful, because in meditation, we can actually explore our own sensual pleasure, and we can actually see how this sensual pleasure develops, how it operates on us, how it causes us to feel. And when you start doing this sort of thing, then you start actually seeing things in a different picture. I mean, one of the problems with sensual pleasure, which I'm actually not supposed to talk, I'm supposed to talk about it in the next second, but anyway, this is a natural place to talk about it, is part of the problem is, again, the real problem is actually attachment. Because one example that Buddha gave, I think, is very helpful. Buddha talked about this wonderful image of, imagine taking an ultra sharp knife and spreading honey along the edge of it. So what Buddha said is that, the honey part is fine. That's the sensual pleasure. But the problem is can you lick that honey off of this extremely sharp edge without cutting your tongue? Because this cutting part of the knife is actually the attachment. And it's actually the attachment that's the problem. And of course, the deeper problem is that it's hard to have the sensual pleasure and give up the attachment. Because almost always, especially under very high levels of sensual pleasure, attachment almost comes immediately. And it's like, oh, we never want to give this up. This is so wonderful. It's like an instant addiction, if you like. And it's really the attachment that causes the suffering. And one maybe helpful example of a way around it is actually mindfulness meditation. Because the whole idea of mindfulness meditation, as I was talking about this form of meditation, if when we're meditating, we can get rid of this notion of ego, the sense of, oh, I'm feeling pleasure, but more do it in more of a detached way. Oh, pleasure is arising in my mind. And if you can do that, coupled with the idea, which is also part of mindfulness meditation, that each moment our life is changing moment by moment. So at this moment, this pleasure is there, but maybe it won't be there in the next moment. And to be totally okay with that. And when you're in a completely observing condition, when you're just a pure observer, then you can see that what happens is it helps you get rid of that attachment, because it's like, oh, there's this. Oh, this next moment, there's this. And this next moment, there's this. What the attachment is the hanging on to it. You know, it's like, and what happens with the attachment is that we are, most of the time, we're not in the present. We're remembering the previous moment that was so pleasurable, and that's what we're hanging on to. We don't allow our mind to shift moment to moment to what is actually happening to us. Another aspect of it, which is very helpful, is that, as we're going to talk about, there's a cause of attachment. And these causes of attachment are going to be what we're going to talk about, kleshas or afflictions. And these things, what happens in a klesha or affliction, of which there's three, greed, hatred, and confusion or ignorance. But anyway, what happens is part of the mechanism that goes on is the mechanism of exaggeration. Whenever we have these, what are called these three poisons, these three kleshas or afflictions, which are the root ones, and more things spring from that. But anyway, it's easier for now just to simplify to that. Whenever these things are present, our mind is always disturbed. And this is a form of negativity. It's always a form of attachment. And attachment can be positive or negative. Positive attachment is where you have something that you love, that you desire, that you're trying to bring close to you and hang on to. Negative attachment is aversion, where there's something you don't like and you're attached to pushing it away, if you like. But what goes on is there's always exaggeration. When we have these afflictions, these desires, these attachments, almost always we are in our minds. And in our minds, we are exaggerating the qualities of things, either positively or negatively. So if there's something we really like, so if we go in a store and there's some piece of jewelry or something that we're totally infatuated with, what happens is that we exaggerate all the qualities. We blow them up. We make them so that they're so that the object is so much bigger and better than anything we could have imagined. And that's what causes our attachment, because we exaggerate how good it is and we avoid looking at any of its defects. We only see the good parts because we develop these kinds of exaggerations. That's why we get so attached to it. We feel like, oh, I can't live without it. And it goes the same way with negative states of mind, aversion, where there's something that we hate. If there's some person we dislike that we think of as our enemy, we exaggerate we only look at their bad qualities. We never see any of their good qualities. And we exaggerate how bad they are. They think, oh, this person is so horrible in this way. And we act as though they're the worst person on earth. And then as we think about it more and more and focus our mind more and more on their bad qualities, our dislike or our aversion gets stronger and stronger. So it's sort of like an attachment to the bad qualities of the object that really make us want to push it away or develop hatred or negative emotions toward it. So I don't know whether that's helpful at all.
Well, it is helpful. I was kind of in a unique situation. Before even COVID hit, I was extremely isolated. I had a few years ago left my ex-husband of, had been together 13 years. And my family, I basically ran away overnight to escape the abuse. And I had to leave my adult children and everything behind overnight and move to a different state, a different culture, everything. And I had really no friends. The friend that I was living with at the time turned out to be not pretty much the opposite of emotionally available. And then I had a crisis happen at that time. And I just ended up shopping. I ended up, basically replacing, the friends, the whole tribe I used to have with all this stuff. And it took me the longest time, up until really now to figure out what I was doing. And it's this, I don't know, it's kind of hard to figure out. It's a difficult for me kind of form of attachment because I'm still pretty isolated. I don't really have any close friends anywhere near me. I stay by myself a lot of the time. I go to work, I come home, I don't really have a life. And my attempts so far to forge friendships here haven't really panned out, either because people live so far away from me or I just can't connect on intellectual or emotional level. So it's been 5 years since I left my ex-husband, and it's been, yeah, I've accumulated a lot of crap. And
Yeah.
so this is what I'm working through right now. So this is very helpful. So thank you.
Yeah. No, it is difficult because we often, especially when we're feeling bad, we want little creature comforts to sort of comfort us. However, ultimately the way through is actually always understanding, and especially in meditation, we have, especially if you do this mindfulness meditation, which is more like just focusing, for example, on your breath, and then just watching what emerges in your mind, but not hanging on to it. It's just noting whatever emerges and then returning to the breath again and again, which is sometimes called Vipassana meditation in some contexts, in some Buddhist cultures, but or insight meditation. But with that, you can sometimes gain, if you can just sit with that and sort of watch all of these things as they go through your mind, and also how they affect you. You can sometimes actually, it can almost be like your own psychotherapist. It can actually be very helpful in sort of understanding your own behavior. And then as you understand it, it's that understanding that actually enables change, that enables you, when you see the real way that things actually develop. And again, doing this meditation, the important thing is not to, when these things come up, don't attach to it. Don't say, oh, I feel terrible, or I feel this. It's more like this feeling arises in my mind. You really have to develop this kind of objectivity in your meditation. But sometimes that can actually be very helpful. But there's actually one technique that I have found to be very powerful and very helpful. And I feel like it's sort of over time has been slowly changing my life. And it was a teaching that Buddha himself gave. And in fact, he said it was one of the most powerful teachings of all, creates enormous amounts of good karma, which we will talk more about coming up. But in my mind, the thing that is wonderful about it is that it's so simple. And so it's called, it has different names, sometimes the four measurables, The Buddha in his life called it the Brahma Vihara, the highest dwelling place. It has a lot of different names, but the first two of them, I think, are the most important. And so here's how you practice it. So let's say you're at the grocery store and you're watching the checkout clerk, handling the stuff of the person in front of you. You just sit and you think about that person, and as hard as you can, you think, may you be happy. And then after that, you think, may you be free from suffering. May you never suffer. And just think that, and even though you don't know that person from Adam, even though you know nothing about that person, just try to develop those two feelings as strongly as possible. And then watch what happens in your feelings and mind. And if you're like most people, what you will find is you will feel a real spark of happiness. It's just spontaneous. It's just wonderful. You can also do this driving down the road. Somebody cuts in front of you. Instead of getting angry and yelling at them, you think, may you be happy. May you be free from suffering. And try to, even though it's sort of fabricated, try to identify with that as strongly as possible and just see how it feels. And what you will discover is that if you keep doing this all the time, and I myself do this all the time, you will discover that it will slowly change your life. It'll change how you feel about people. It'll change how you interact with people. It's phenomenal. It is so powerful. The third and fourth parts is, may you never be separated from your happiness, which is called altruistic joy. In other words, may you always have whatever happiness you had, may you continue to have it. And the fourth one is more Buddhist, may you develop equanimity, a type of mind that is neither attached or averse to phenomena. But that's, again, those are harder to understand and explain. So it's good just to stick with the first two ones because everybody can understand it. Just wishing that for people to be genuinely happy and for people not to suffer. And of course, for genuine happiness, actually, the only real happiness is spiritual happiness. But that's a little bit going further along. But anyway, this is a wonderful tool, and you can generalize it. You can wish, may everybody in my city be happy. May they be free from suffering. May everybody in the United States be happy. May they be free from suffering. May everyone in the whole world be happy. May they be free from suffering. And there's a more general notion in Buddhism we call sentient beings. We'll talk about there's other realms besides the human realm. May all sentient beings, all beings with minds, may they be happy, may they be free from suffering. And this is actually, it's an interesting technique. You can also use it at night when you're trying to sleep. So you have all these things cycling through your mind, something happened, you're disturbed, you can't fall asleep. Just practice this type, may people be happy, may people be free from suffering. Just do that. Traditionally, a lot of times you do things in Buddhism 7 times. So I usually do it 7 times. And at the end of the 7th time, I start to feel really relaxed, and it actually helps me fall asleep. So anyway, it's just, this is one of my chief recommendations that I always give to people. And this is something that I have found the most helpful Buddhist practice of all, is just practice this, because it develops a wonderful mind. It's said that, we'll talk about rebirth, that these types of minds will cause you to have one of the highest rebirths possible. But I think the more practical reason is it changes your mind. It makes you a more loving, caring, compassionate person. And it does it in a very direct, powerful way. And even though in the beginning it may seem fabricated, it may seem like you're just pretending to really want these things enough. Even there is a thing in Buddhism, it's a very powerful part of Tantric Buddhism, actually, that just going through the motions can still have a profound impact. So anyway, I would, and when you're lonely and when you feel that you have no friends, practice this. It'll make you feel more connected. It will make you feel happier. It's sort of like instant happiness in my mind. So anyway, I just throw this out as a suggestion.
I will definitely be trying that. Yes. And it's I love the simplicity of it. I've been trying to embrace simplicity more since I had such an analytical mind and spent way too much time in college analyzing the crap out of everything, trying to put, superior hypothesis lens or Wittgensteinian context or some other stuff just because it's so interesting. But it also gets to the point where, Bertrand Russell and his damn table going on forever and every single stupid aspect of the table, and eventually you're just sick of it. So yeah, the direct approach can
Yeah.
be much more useful sometimes.
Yeah, and it's very helpful, pay attention when you practice this, pay attention to how you feel, because you can begin to develop. I mean, there is this notion that spiritual happiness is far, far more satisfactory and more blissful than any sort of normal samsaric happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a way to experience it, because when you start practicing this and trying to do it very genuinely, you get little just blips of bliss, actually. And it's very, very satisfying. And it's sort of, you can, as you pay attention to that feeling, you can feel the difference between what is satisfactory happiness and sort of the dukkha of ordinary sensual pleasure. So it's an interesting thing, and this is what Buddhism is all about. Buddhism is always about experiencing things for yourself, directly seeing how things really are. And the Buddha said actually that Dharma, his teachings, are actually in plain sight. You just have to experience them for yourself. So anyway, I just suggest this as one possibility, which I hope might be helpful. It's been very helpful for me.
I think it will help. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, as I say, I feel that it slowly changes my life. And so you can try it and see if it helps you. Okay, so now we go on. So the final aspect of suffering is that Buddha says that there is actually pervasive suffering. There's suffering just because we're born. And there's this notion, Buddha always talked again and again, that whatever is born must die. So for all of us, since we are born, there's no choice. We have to die. And the same was true for Buddha's physical body. It was a body that was born, and so physically he died. So it's and there's more of this notion of, again, I will talk more about samsara, but the world we're in, actually the reason that we remain in samsara is attachment. And an attachment comes in three forms. It comes in greed or lust, the positive form where we desire things. It comes in aversion or hatred or enmity, the things that we try to push away. And it also is involved in confusion. It's because we are ignorant of the way that our world really works that we develop all of these attachments. We don't realize what they're doing to us and how they actually are the cause of all of our pain and suffering. But at any rate, that's and so the thing I was going to with this is that there is actually a reason why we are reborn in samsara. So Buddha said that when we die, our consciousness continues on. So we don't have any soul. We don't have anything that's permanent about ourself. There is a nominal notion of ourself, which we will talk about more. This has more to do with these notions of emptiness or selflessness. But Buddha said, our self is made up of a body and mind, and both our bodies and minds are constantly changing. There's no one aspect of our body and mind that remains the same for even the blink of an eye. Both our body and mind are constantly changing. As we age, we can definitely see how our body changes. And our mind, our emotions are up and down. This thought comes in our mind, that goes in our mind. Our mind, the mind we have as a 9-year-old is not the same we have as a 50-year-old. So everything about us is constantly changing. But what the Buddha does say is that there is a stream of consciousness, what's sometimes called a mental continuum. And, that stream of consciousness continues. It's that consciousness moment by moment is constantly changing, but there is a continuity to it. And that's sort of what is really the closest we can come to ourself. So it sort of sounds like a permanent self, and it would be if our consciousness was unwavering or unchanged. But our consciousness, our minds change moment by moment. But there is a continuity to it, and we can feel that in our ordinary life. So there is a string, a continuity in all of our lives, even though we're changing, even though as an 8-year-old, we're very different than we are as a 30-year-old or a 50-year-old or older. Nonetheless, there is a continuity. And what the Buddha said is that that continuity continues after death. So that continues on to a next life. But, since there's no permanence as to who we are, there's nothing permanent that goes on to the next life. So whatever personality that we have in this life is a personality that were developed by all the causes and conditions of this life, who our parents were, what our experiences were in this life. And so from that, we develop a certain type of personality. But at death, that personality ends because those causes and conditions are no longer functioning. And we're reborn. We have different parents, different conditions, and so different personality. But there is a continuity of that same consciousness. So in the same way that there's a continuity from our consciousness now, going back to when we were a newborn babe, in the same way that continuity will continue on to a new life. But basically, the only thing that will be transmitted to the new life will be our karma. So that is the notion of rebirth. So it's not that we ourselves are reborn because our personality, who we actually think that we have an identity, that an ego, a permanent self, but actually we don't. If you look closely, you'll see that, we're just a continually changing flow of stuff. So anyway, that's the notion of samsara. And Buddha did say that there are different realms of samsara. There's heavenly realms, godlike realms. There are hell-like realms of great suffering. And there's animals are considered to be one realm. Anything with a mind is what continues on because it's consciousness that continues on. So I would say for us, it's not worth getting too hung up on this, but it's just like, but there is this notion of karma, that all of our actions have results. And if we have positive or virtuous or non-harming, beneficial actions, they result in pleasure, future pleasurable moments, future good things happening to us. And if we engage in negative activity, especially harmful things, where we are harming other sentient beings in particular, those are non-virtuous, and those will eventually lead to one form or another of suffering. And all of this is highly variable. The Buddha said that essentially an ordinary person really can't understand how all this works. Only a Buddha, a perfect being who has sort of infinite abilities, can actually see how it works. But this mechanism does exist. And so on one level, there is a goal in Buddhism of leading positive lives, leading lives that are beneficial, non-harming, and trying to avoid harmful or negative actions because they affect how we're reborn. Now, there's also this notion in karma of ripening karma. So sometimes there's sort of a model that each action that we perform creates like a little seed of karma. And then at some point that seed of karma ripens and you get some result. And so this I think is helpful to people. So they think of, well, our mental continuum is storing up all of this karma, and eventually it will ripen. However, that's a very simplistic model, I would say, and you can't really trust it very hard. It contains some aspect of the way that things work, but actually the way that karma comes to fruition is highly variable. And it also, everything in Buddhism depends on causes and conditions. So, for example, if you're leading a very virtuous life now, if you have a mind of loving kindness, of wishing to benefit people, if you're basically a good person, even though you might have killed somebody in a previous life, that negative karma is not one-to-one. So if you killed somebody in a previous life, it doesn't mean that in the future somebody will kill you. It just means that some negative thing will happen to you in the future. And what that negative thing is will depend upon who you are when it ripens. And so it's a very highly nonlinear effect. And so since we can't do anything about our previous karma, I think the only clear aspect that you can take away from all of this is the better your spiritual life now that you can create, the less negative karma will affect you. It can still affect you. Bad things can happen to you, but it will be ameliorated if you are a really good person. And the other thing too is that we tend to think, again, simplistically, oh, I've done this one thing, so in the future, one thing will happen to us. And that's too simplistic because we're constantly performing actions. And so we have millions of different pieces of karma stored up within our mental continuum. And any of these can come to fruition. And usually there's many things coming to fruition simultaneously. Some good things, usually at any given moment, there is a fruition of some bad things and some good things from our previous lives. And so it's also jumbled up that there's no way that we can predict any of it. And so I think the point of it is not to worry about it, but to worry about, not to worry about, but just to focus on leading a good life. But I think, again, all of this is very abstract. And as ordinary human beings, we can't see the karma that we have from our past. We can't see the karma that we're creating now. It's sort of all this invisible stuff. But what you can directly experience is you can directly experience the benefits of your positivity in this moment. For example, I was giving the example of sitting there and just wishing the person next to you to be happy. You could immediately feel the goodness, the benefit of what's happening then. It's a direct one-to-one. You feel it immediately in the moment. And so I would say that the real purpose of a spiritual life is to make your life happier moment by moment. And so that's what I focus on. I try to focus on becoming a better person moment by moment. And I think if you do that, you will find everything else will take care of itself. If you just focus on that being a better person moment by moment, eventually you will be creating the causes and conditions for nirvana, for enlightenment. It will all happen by itself. You don't have to worry about it. As I find with many people in Buddhism, we get hung up by these notions of nirvana and enlightenment. We sort of feel like, well, if I don't achieve this tomorrow, I'm a complete failure. And nothing else I do in my spiritual life matters if I don't achieve this goal. Especially in America, we're so goal-oriented and we're a little bit insane, actually. But I think the better thing is just build your life, make it better moment by moment. And the power of a spiritual life is you can feel that goodness, that benefit, that feeling better moment by moment as you practice the spiritual path. And so I think it's more important to focus on that. And so, of course, you can do all the things. You can get teachings, you can go to meditation, you can do spiritual practice, even these special techniques like loving kindness and so forth. There's a lot of things you can do, but I think it's important to be sort of practical and not get hung up on these bigger pictures. Because, you know, it's like I say, we ourselves, we don't see all these other realms of existence. We can see animals, but we have, you know, we don't experience what happens when we die, rebirth and that sort of thing. All of these things for us are very abstract. Although the Buddha said that at the higher levels of meditation, you will actually directly see all of these things for yourself. And when the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree, he could directly see all of his previous lives. He could see other beings, how karma was affecting them, how they were being reborn and so forth. And many other people, even before achieving enlightenment, can achieve a high spiritual attainment where they experience many of these things and can directly see them also. But again, I would say, you know, focus on the practical thing. Try to be happier moment by moment. And what you will discover, especially if you do some mindfulness meditation, is you will discover that your life gets better moment by moment, that wonderful things happen. So anyway, that's what my advice to you is. So there is all this karma stuff, and it's very complex. And in fact, like I say, because, you know, it's not just one thing happening, but many things are happening. And karma can ripen immediately. Karma can ripen later in this life. Karma can ripen in your next life. Karma can ripen 1,000 lifetimes from now. You know, there are causes and conditions that determine which karma ripens at any given moment. But again, if you lead a deeply spiritual life, you are sort of creating causes and conditions for good karma to ripen. So I would say there's a really good reason to practice a spiritual life. You know, so we don't have any control over karma, but we do have control over our spiritual life. And so I think that's very beneficial. Okay. Okay, yeah, and what's known as samsara, this notion of samsara is the more correct definition is cyclic existence. So it's the cycle of constantly leading a life and then being reborn. Our consciousness continues on to a next life. That next life ends, consciousness continues to the next life forever. And it's said in Buddhism that, you know, we have these 6 realms, some godlike realms that are extremely pleasurable, long-lived. There's terrible realms, more hell-like realms. In fact, we see that on Earth. We see similitudes of heavenly realms and hell-like realms on Earth. You know, we see people who seem to never get sick, seem to have tons of money, seem to always be happy, never have anything terrible happen to them. They're almost like a god on Earth. And at times we see people who live absolutely hellish existence, just extremely painful, horrible things happen to them with deep, deep suffering. And those are sort of similitudes of hell realms. So we can even see that on Earth. The same thing happens in the animal realms. We have some of our pets, some of our cats and dogs that are almost like in heavenly realms. You know, they're pampered by their owners, every need taken care of. And there are animals that suffer intensely, especially in the wild, that lead almost hellish existence, extremely painful existences. So again, this is all believed to achieve through karma. But again, you know, I would not focus too much on it, because I think it's something that is a little bit almost beyond us. So it's like the Buddha was always very practical. He was always talking about focusing on the things that you can do, the things that, you know, where you can change. And I think that's the best way of dealing with this. So at this point, I see that it's 8:30, and I make it a clear plan never to go over the hour, because I know some people, they stay up late and it's hard for them. And it's also very tiresome when you listen to someone going on and on for such a long time. It can be sort of intense and tiresome. So I always make an effort to stop exactly at 8:30. And somehow, though, no matter how many questions I'm asked, I always manage to finish the course. So I'm sure I will finish the course and get through everything. So I would not worry about it. So maybe I'll end there. But so next time I will continue on the Four Noble Truths. And as you can see, the more we talk about it, we get more deeper into the things that are traditionally associated with Buddhism, selflessness, karma, even renunciation, and so forth. And so I will finish up on the Four Noble Truths next time, and then move on to the bodhicitta and the Mahayana path. But still, even though we've hit 8:30, there's still time for questions. So let me ask if there's any last questions that anyone has. Okay. And if question, okay.
Not really.
Okay, that's good. And and as you think about what we've talked about tonight, questions may arise during the week. And if that happens, just write them down and bring them up, and we can talk about them first thing next week. Because learning Buddhism is sort of, the Buddha himself actually gave an explanation of learning Buddhism. It's like having a sandy seashore where you gradually walk deeper and deeper into the ocean. And Buddhism, everything is continuous. And so you sort of develop slowly. And so as you study Buddhism more and learn more about it, it's like your realizations slowly deepen and your understanding slowly deepens. So you have to be patient. It's like at first everything seems new and a little bit crazy, but then over time things slowly start to make more sense. They start to connect with each other. And so I think the important thing is just to be patient. But anyway, if you do, if you do think about things during the week, just write them down. And then we'll, at the beginning of next week, you should definitely ask your questions. And if not, we will just continue on. So, okay, thank you. Thank you for showing up and being here. And we will forge ahead. We've got 2 more sessions.
Sounds good. Thanks so much. Have a great night.
Okay, good night.